Welcome to Narrative Machines, a theory podcast that explores memetics, myth, and propaganda, how our narratives define the limits of our political and personal identity, how they can be controlled, how this era may be consigned to myth just as it was defined by it. Previous drafts of these ideas were published in 2017 in Narrative Machines, Mythos Media, in 2020 in Masks, Bowie and Artists of Artifice, Intellect and University of Chicago, and in various now defunct web publications. It is presented here in audio format for the first time with additional reflections and editorial. For more of the author's work in various mediums and formats, visit jamescurcio.com. You can also find more podcasts and articles about RPGs and collective storytelling at modernmythology.net. Episode 3, With Whose Voice Do We Speak? The map is the idea of the map. The anxiety that underlies the wholesale exchange of the profane for the sacred can produce a nostalgic throwback to the old-time religion. Yearning for sacred origins has long been a political tool of those who would wield it. The aura of a fondly remembered yesterday drives such cultural movements as we see demonstrated in the 2006 documentary Jesus Camp. And this trend is evident in many revivalist, traditionalist, and reactionary groups across the world, not just Christianity. In America, it has a basis in a mythos that references the mentality of the paranoid Cold War era, repainting it as a golden age of idyllic family values, when men were men and women knew their place, which reach from that time, and before, right up to the present. Beneath that strata is a mythos of the Confederacy, of stolen glory, and the various mythologies that underlie evangelism. As histories, these were mostly fictional, even in their time. Now, they are hyper-real. The Trump campaign's call to make America great again, strikingly similar to a defunct slogan of Reagan's from the 80s, is in either event an appeal to an alternate history that never was. Authoritarianism is not an appeal to truth, it is an appeal to power, and fundamentally, the power that imaginal myth can have upon the real. This defensive reaction, to look backwards in times of chaos, cannot be restricted to one ideology. It is one of the forms of modern mythology that we most frequently encounter. According to Samuel P. Huntington in his somewhat infamous book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, the coming world conflicts will be driven along ideological and cultural fault lines, even if underlying motivational factors in some cases include more material concerns, such as territory or overburdened resources, the interests of individual actors, or even blind organizational output. This premise has obvious flaws. Ideology is generally a distillation of power relations rather than the other way around. So we shouldn't seek to distinguish our myths and ideology from the real dynamics that they arise in. However, within the context of myth we've established, it also bears consideration. Let's look at a recent example. Perception of conflict driven by these factors itself can be a veil, as we see further afield in Russia's apparent insistence on following the mythology of Mackinder's Geopolitics, a framing which was quite evident in Putin's statements when the Russian campaign in Ukraine intensified in 2022.
Russia's push into Georgia in 2008, into Ukraine in 2014, and its recent campaign in Syria, as well as its efforts to consolidate a sphere of influence in the inner Eurasian heartland of the former USSR, called the Eurasian Union, all are eerily foretold in geopolitical theory. Mackinder held that geography, not economics, is the fundamental determinant of world power, and Russia, simply by virtue of its physical location, inherits a primary global role. Under President Vladimir Putin, the slightly kooky tenets of Mackinder's theory have made inroads into the establishment, mostly because of one man, Alexander Dugin, a right-wing intellectual and bohemian who emerged from the perestroika era in the 1980s as one of Russia's chief nationalists. The unlikely origins of Russia's manifest destiny foreign policy.
If we accept the conjecture that Mackinder's Geopolitics is central to current Russian foreign policy, then we must also accept that a purely mythological story about the world is informing what happens in the real world. The geopolitical events in the time since that article was written seem to contribute to this premise. Despite the sidelining of figures like Dugin and Surkov, who gained a certain infamy in the US and UK press during the period of Trump's first term, even while simultaneously declining in influence within Russia. An influence which was, particularly in the former case, more a matter of theory and rhetoric than central political influence.
Drawing on the extensive 20th century literature on geopolitics, and especially on the interwar German school of Karl Haushofer, Dugin posits a primordial, dualistic conflict between Atlanticism, seafaring states and civilizations, such as the United States and Britain, and Eurasianism, land-based states and civilizations, such as Eurasia, Russia. As Wayne Allensworth noted, once one penetrates below the surface of Dugin's seemingly rational and scholarly language in Foundations of Geopolitics, one realizes that Dugin's geopolitics are mystical and occult in nature, the shape of world civilizations and the clashing vectors of historical development being portrayed as shaped by unseen spiritual forces beyond man's comprehension. Alexander Dugin's Foundations of Geopolitics, Dunlop.
The map is literally the idea of the map. We must also come to terms with the fact that Dugin's interpretation of this ideology explicitly uses the methods of postmodernism to attempt to strike at the West, or as he calls it, Atlanticism. Perhaps what is most interesting about Duginism is not that it actually directly describes Russian foreign policy, but rather that it invents a myth out of cobbled-together parts, a very postmodern gesture, and thereby attempts to retroactively take credit for actions that happen to fall in line. Dugin himself should of course not be taken seriously, aside from serving as a sort of funhouse mirror inversion of theories developed mostly by the left for decades, the so-called postmodern world we were warned about in those theories, and which we have in the time since come to inhabit. That is despite the fact that postmodernism, quote-unquote, is something we often wish to distance ourselves from within left movements. More on this later. Though everything else about Dugin's critique is regressive, he is right about one thing: liberalism, or specifically the moderate right-wing neoliberalism and Benthamite utilitarianism that has increasingly taken its place, fractures innate community. Constructing it instead through reducible and reproducible acts, and individual identity is then lent us purely through our external function and esteemed value. Dugin's prevarications are precisely in line with how myth and ideology collude to instruct, or rather construct, geopolitics, and we can also see in this a glimmer of our methodological objectives. Through the imposition of a mythology, we thereby shape the world in its image. We mustn't confuse the one for the other, merely because the methodology may have similar foundations. Consider.
Also striking are attempts to identify the continuity of unreason in fascism and post-structuralism. In an effort to combat the philosophical anarchism of modern social theory, intellectual historians such as Wolin suggest obliquely that because both fascists and post-structuralists question the premises of Occidental rationalism and American cultural leadership, there is an equivalence between the right-wing assault on democracy in fascist and neoconservative ideology and the post-structuralist critique of the democratic basis of Western culture. Not only do arguments of this kind ignore the obvious substantive distinction between radical right-wing and radical left-wing criticisms of liberalism in an attempt to implicate the soft totalitarianism of the left as an amoral betrayal of Enlightenment universalism, but are oblivious to the real and present danger implicit in neoconservative, neo-fascist, and right-wing fundamentalist attacks on emancipatory politics.
Postmodernism as skepticism toward all meta-narratives, Lyotard, claims to expose the flaw in both centered and decentered worldviews. But what does an absolute skepticism toward all frames of reference do but create an unending regress of deconstruction in the hands of academics, while the powerful institutions in society use those same techniques to create a corporatist state that appears inassailable to traditional methods of cultural subversion? We mustn't forget that the methods of postmodernism are available for appropriation to any end, as we can see in their use not only by the neoliberal or centrist corporate power structures, but also the authoritarian right. And in some cases, this use is quite explicit, as we see in Alexander Dugin's inversions, subversions, his theoretic propaganda. Nothing is true was never actually the postmodern message, it was the postmodern warning. If communication is what is heard rather than what is said, maybe we can say the warning and the message have become the same thing. A reality in which only the most vulgar kind of nihilism can thrive. Neoliberalism, neoconservatism, neo-fascism. We may still have our clear preferences, but there is no room left for dreamers. War is what Nothing is True got us, because it was never available as a form of liberation from the past, which was the feverish hope. An escape from the repetition of history, which in truth neither repeats nor rhymes, yet somehow never ceases to feel familiar. Instead, it merely cleared a path for the types of powers which require no justification for their own existence and growth without end. The joke may have no punchline, but the setup is that for all that, it is true. Nothing is true. Too many took away the wrong message from the death of their idols. As a society, we clearly weren't and aren't ready. This isn't a radical departure from Nietzsche's God is dead, which in a sense was never about God at all, but instead about answering how we could possibly bridge the gap between living with and without that mutually supporting illusion. God as the lifelong witness, the one who makes our stories real. It's a symbiotic relationship. We make our gods real, and they save us from reality. Truth, nation, money, and God have always been dead. They were among the many myths we told ourselves to make into sense, to keep the chaos at bay. Now that capitalist realism has bridged the gap between the ideologies of former Cold War powers and superpowers, while serving the PRC, Saudi Arabia, or Russia as it does the West, it has not brought supposed Western values, but rather exposed the lie that capitalism necessarily has anything to do with democracy or liberty, whether at home or abroad. The great debate of history is fundamentally literary. While intended to level the playing field and put power under critique, this approach can have unintended effects. All tools can be a weapon. There is a growing anxiety about our post-truth world, as it is having real effects on our ability to agree on the basic facts. Epistemic collapse. We are, increasingly, not even operating in analogous maps. No longer left and right. It is Universe A and Universe B. We are instructed how to read the world through our texts, and in this sense, we are indebted to the postmodernists, though as we've seen, this can be taken too far. Myth is neither pure fantasy nor a true material force. For as central as narratives are to human life, gravity is not merely a matter of interpretation.
One of the ideas that I attack in my book is precisely the primacy of interpretations and of conceptual frameworks. Ideas and beliefs are important and do play a role in history, but academics of different brands have reduced all material and energetic processes and all human practices that are not linguistic or interpretative. Think of manual skills of know-how to a framework. The 20th century has been obsessed with positioning everything. Every culture, given that it has its own framework of beliefs, has become its own world, and relativism, both moral and epistemological, now prevails. But once you break away from this outmoded view, once you accept all the non-linguistic practices that really make up society, not to mention the non-human elements that also shape it, such as viruses, bacteria, weeds, or non-organic energy and material flows like wind and ocean currents, then language itself becomes just another material that flows through a much expanded picture. Language, in my view, is best thought of as a catalyst, a trigger for energetic processes. Think of the words "begin the battle" triggering an enormous and destructive process. From Roy Christopher's interview of Manuel de Landa.
The nested holocaust of models all the way down, seems to be a theme with this line of inquiry. But how does one make a model with no central organizing principle to base it on? As Nietzsche recognized, philosophy, whether epistemological or ethical, often amounts to juggling this hierarchy of values, and that is nothing more than the power struggle which has always defined human societies. Even resource-driven conflicts are likely to be conceptualized in ideological terms, especially to the people who make up the backbone of any military. The US, as a global peacekeeper saving the world from itself, is such a myth as well, piggybacking on the overarching myth of American exceptionalism. This sort of myth is in no way exceptional. We paint in-groups and out-groups in mythic terms. There is an echo of this in most historical conflicts, such disparate times as the Crusades of the Middle Ages. After Richard the Lionhearted captured Acre in 1191, he ordered 3,000 captives, many of them women and children, taken outside the city and slaughtered. Some were disemboweled in a search for swallowed gems. Spoiler, they didn't have gems in their bowels. Rather than being a classic example of the removed brutalities of the past, this is not so different from the rhetoric that is used to embed fear of the immigrant others of today. The fundamental drive behind fanaticism and fascism, which is an affliction not unlike fanaticism, is psychological, not material. Rather, material conditions direct the flow of energy towards one mythic formulation rather than another. Wilhelm Reich explored this in The Mass Psychology of Fascism, and this, taken from a chapter appropriately and perhaps ironically named Ideology as a Material Force.
Those who followed the revolutionary left's application of Marxism between 1917 and 1933 had to notice that it was restricted to the sphere of objective economic processes and government policies, but that it neither kept a close eye on nor comprehended the development and contradictions of the so-called subjective factor of history, i.e., the ideology of the masses.
The fascism of the state is the fascist within. This alchemy produces poisonous splinter factions, fundamentalist groups that cause many of the pathological habits our cultures otherwise exhibit in concentrated form. Though always a sort of mass movement, it is contained in miniature within each individual psyche, since, after all, the center of the circle around which all turns is only a product of the collective imagination. The extremists at the front lines of ideological conflicts hear the echoes of myths originating thousands of years ago, catalyzing the existential fear, hate, or desire latent in a culture, and more pointedly, within the individuals that comprise that culture. Fascism is an art movement gone horribly wrong. On its face, this idea may seem like an empty provocation, but it is an idea we will be returning to numerous times. You can draw your own conclusions. The literalization of a mythical aesthetic can be the first step of this process. Here, Lacan's observation that the unconscious is structured like a language is key.
The unconscious is structured like the assemblages in set theory, which are like letters, Lacan.
This has bearing on myth as mass dream, most crucially at the times revolution strikes, or at the point of any state change. Analysis of mass narratives with the aid of technology can bear fruit in this direction, though as we will see, it is not an endeavor without its difficulties and dangers. Politics or even religious ideology shouldn't form the only lens to gaze at myth in modern culture. As discussed in episode 1, military memetics is itself congruent with notions of the epidemiology of ideas, and the level of scrutiny in this direction has already been considerable.
Using the analogy that ideologies possess the same theoretical characteristics as a disease, particularly as complex adaptive systems, then a similar method and routine should be applied to combating them. Memes can and should be used like medicine to inoculate the enemy and generate popular support. Memetics, a growth industry in US military operations.
According to a memo spread in 2006, written by former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, the long war against terrorism is a war of ideas.
Today, the centers of gravity of the conflict in Iraq and the global war on terror are not on the battlefield overseas. Rather, the center of gravity of this war are the centers of public opinion in the US and in the capitals of free nations. The gateways to those centers are the international media hubs and the capitals of the world. Zawahiri has said that 50% of the current struggle is taking place in the arena of public information. That may be an understatement. Osama bin Laden, Zawahiri, Zarqawi had media committees that consistently outpace our ability to respond.
The propagandic methods of ISIS followed precisely from this observation, though it is a notable irony that they also follow a historical path that Rumsfeld shares some personal responsibility in paving. There are considerable risks contained in the future synthesis of mythology and psychometrics, the measure of personality, as we've seen in a nascent form in the rise of Trump and other populist longshots, who leaned quite heavily on Cambridge Analytica in 2016, and other data firms who have become quite adept at interpreting and manipulating mass narratives. The age of polling as the leading edge in political analysis may be through, or perhaps our attraction to such narratives drives their own propagation in an economy sculpted by the ad value of a click.
Trump's conspicuous contradictions and his oft-criticized habit of staking out multiple positions on a single issue result in a gigantic number of resulting messaging options that creates a huge advantage for a firm like Cambridge Analytica. For every voter, a different message. Mathematician Cathy O'Neill had already observed in August that Trump is like a machine learning algorithm that adjusts to public reactions. The granularity of this message tailoring digs all the way down to tiny target groups, Nix explained to Das Magazine. We can target specific towns or apartment buildings, even individual people, Das Magazine.
Suddenly, our fanciful stories are anything but coffee shop talk, and we're paying a little more attention. Myth is on the lips, minds, and knife points of those in the midst of active revolution, as well as those working in the media.
Memes influence ideas. Ideas influence and form beliefs. Beliefs generate and influence political positions combined with feelings and emotions, eventually producing actions which inform and influence behavior. Using this logic progression, any attack upon an ideology must consider an assault on a central or transcendent idea or group of ideas as means of achieving success. Memes as ideas are then in play as tools or means to attack ideologies. Memetics, a growth industry in US military operations.
Group narratives are always being repurposed, whether we speak of the selective use of scripture by religious fundamentalists, or the more bizarre relationship between National Socialism and occultism, which underlined the rise of the Third Reich, despite Hitler's professed abhorrence for the occult. Fringe elements are at most times culturally inert, but have the potential to overcome the whole of a culture during crisis points, as the Nazis did after World War I. Some of the recent concern over the rise of the loose conglomeration of far-right, paleo-conservative, and various openly white nationalist groups has been along these lines, though the shape it will take is unclear. However, myth as a whole cannot be considered at fault for such misuse. Religion is not to blame for witch-burning or terrorist bombings, nor can the instinct behind myth be killed, in any event. We can replace people's myths, but we cannot take them away. It can be a healing as well as destructive force.
For there is always going on within us a process of formulation and interpretation whose subject matter is our own selves, mimesis.
Misappropriation is one of the many powerful propagandic tools available to anyone with a mind to find a new use for an old idea. Symbols have no one single specific meaning, no one specific purpose, but they can have many guises and uses. Memes like Pepe the Frog demonstrate this perfectly clearly. The cartoon was put to use by racists much as the swastika was repurposed by the Nazis. But that does not make cartoon frogs or swastikas inherently racist by virtue of the symbol itself. Symbols aren't just ripe for appropriation, they are a means for it. Yet, at one and the same time, symbols refer to something and the meaning of the whole can be changed as we collectively wrestle over what the significance of that reference actually is. So we might see culture as the fundamental struggle between unconscious complexes, all vying over the meaning of the signs that we toss back and forth. Who is really in control of their symbols? Certainly, it is we who are under their thrall. Myth supersedes us. For instance, the self is a narrative palimpsest by which we narrate to ourselves our memories and relationships with one another and ourselves. We live in relation to the narrative as much as any real world that dwells beyond. There is reason to believe that each time we call a memory to mind, we edit it slightly. We draw over it, lightly in watercolors or etched in broad ink strokes. If at this point we have any lingering doubt about the centrality of myth in our extended communal and personal lives, one need only to witness how, without changing our behavior, someone can change you from hero to villain, friend to foe, or back again. Imagine if everyone who knows you suddenly had their memories of you erased. Your wife, your friends, perhaps your children. What would have changed? Whatever you are, independent of their stories, would be the same. And yet, you would find yourself a stranger in your own home, in a sense, a stranger in your own skin. You would be forced to rebuild yourself anew. This is precisely why breakups can be so excruciating. Perhaps your partner's memory of you isn't erased, but it has likely been overwritten. 10 years of shared memories, a collectively built identity, and now you are simply the crazy ex. Our relationships and identities are stories. The dimensions of this process are endless, and try as we might to extricate ourselves, it is our investment in one particular narrative over another that defines the ethical sphere. This may be a choice, or it is habitual, but it is always an added layer. Does an organ exist to serve a purpose, or did it arise coincidentally out of specific contexts, only later to develop to available uses as the context changed? We are the same, organs adapted over time in relation to the demands of a changing world, without intrinsic purpose, but not without use. Myth is the battlefront of the future, as well as the past. It determines who we are to one another, who we are to ourselves. The culture war is innately occult. He who controls the word, at scale, controls the world. If there is some kind of higher order hive mind, that's a part of the cultural matrix as well. Our cultural consciousness, the hive mind, is a crucial and yet ignored component of the total human being.
While current US military practices may view ideologies as diseases, they do not acknowledge the emergent properties of memes as the disease vector. To amplify this disparity, there is a nexus at the crossroads of sociology, anthropology, cognitive science, and behavioral game theory that can help us to intentionally persuade, inoculate large audiences or hosts through subtle or overt contact. Memetics, a growth industry in US military operations.
The social realm is always dictated by forms of performance, but despite how this may seem, it is not a role we choose. This has always been the failing of systems such as Peter Carroll's early approach to chaos magic in Liber Null, or Robert Anton Wilson's reality tunnel manipulation, that we can simply jump from one internal narrative or belief to the next, like flipping a switch. This presupposes not only complete psychological agency, but control of the narratives we have already been cast in by fickle fate. As Jung wrote in Psyche and Symbol, Just as our free will clashes with necessity in the outside world, so also it finds its limits outside the field of consciousness in the subjective inner world, where it comes into contact with the facts of the self. We cannot merely remove how others perceive us and replace it with another, as if identity were a simple mask, with a single true self lurking beneath it. Generations of accumulated myth and history don't vanish simply by changing beliefs. As most non-white Americans will probably attest to, we're cast in a play that was running long before we showed up. However, we can participate in the rewriting of the code that informs our constructs. Retro-future apocalypse.
The retreat into the forest, Wolfgang, is not to be understood as a form of anarchism directed against the world of technology, although this is a temptation, particularly for those who strive to regain a myth. Undoubtedly, mythology will appear again. It is always present and arises in a propitious hour like a treasure coming to the surface. But man does not return to the realm of myth. He re-encounters it when the age is out of joint and in the magic circle of extreme danger. It is not a question, therefore, of choosing the forest or the ship, but of choosing both the forest and the ship. The number of those who want to abandon the ship is growing, and among them are clear heads and fine minds. But it amounts to a disembarkation in mid-ocean. Hunger will follow, and cannibalism, and the sharks. In short, all the terrors that have been reported from the raft of Medusa. Hence, it is advisable under all circumstances to stay aboard, even at the danger of being blown up.
Our remembrance and recreation of the past in new forms is critically important to how we aestheticize the present. It situates us within that scheme of collective memory which is so key in fabricating a mass myth. For after all, aren't we just participants in a collective dream, who forget ourselves and our world upon waking to non-existence? And what is capitalist mythology but commodified aesthetics stripped of exterior ideology? Clearly, we cannot say we have really looked at the forces at play here without also considering the cultural mythologization of time. We live with an emphasis on the past, the present, or the future. Many so-called primitive cultures are past-oriented. The focus of their cosmogony, their festivals and rites and so on, all relate towards connecting with the time before, when the world was hewn, when man was taught to work with fire or tools, or so on. Ancestor worship is often a factor here as well, and in such a frame, it is the dead who are truly immortal. This is also the operative frame of traditionalism. Examples of this exist throughout Eliade's The Sacred and the Profane, which we have already touched on, as well as Alan Dundee's essay, Thinking Ahead, which we will be turning to in a moment. There are also examples of present-oriented cultures, or even models of time that we can't easily frame in any of these contexts, as has been observed in several Australian Aborigine tribes. We have a need to recreate a sense of connection with the past. It is to the past that many seek to find identity. Yet this fantasy exists within the imaginal field of the future, without anything but media images of that past to envision it in. We invent new aesthetic mythologies, encapsulating identity in a look or a sound. One of the more absurd examples of this could be found in the retro-futurist visions of vaporwave, a genre popular in the 2010s, which plays into a form of nostalgia for manufactured memory snippets, a virtualized fever dream glimpsed from elevator music and obscure songs from popular artists. The sounds of generations past, merely half remembered and elaborated on. Trapped within Big Brother's Windows 95 in a terminal K-hole, we enter a liminal space constructed of liminal spaces, an abandoned shopping mall haunted by the spectre of a world we've never been to, and can only recall through these media fragments. The backlash of nationalism is an instinctive regression against the threat of an alien future, an attempt to escape into a fantasy of the aristocratic class stability that preceded World War I. Views of the future are almost always comically painted in the clothes of the present. A fascination with the aesthetics of retrofuturism and Lovecraftian horror lead the politics of the Dark Enlightenment. As theatre, it has a theoretic appeal, not unlike cyberpunk. Indeed, one might think of its premises as presenting the status quo of global villainy in most cyberpunk settings. As anything else, it is a banal reprisal of the worst atrocities of modernity, deified as a force of nature. We must also keep in mind that mass movements are the result of subconscious, systemic forces, rather than a prescribed individual decision. Trumpism is one example of many. It was hard to predict precisely because we rarely recognize mass psychology at work until it latches onto a cause or explicit ideology. That doesn't mean these forces derive from one cause. Quite the opposite. This is the function of appropriation, for well or ill. With each passage from mouth to mouth, another layer is painted on top, or another element deleted. The apparent acceleration of history will make many of the examples presented seem dated by next week. Herein is the imperative for retrofuturism to stake a claim in the past rather than the present. The past is a known quantity, fixed in time. The present seems to slip by ever faster because the increase of media output presents a sense of time dilation. The contemporary is so ephemeral that we need to ground it in the past. The present becomes how we re-aestheticize the past. Modernity may be a state of hypernormalization, to live not in the past, but in a vision of the future that relies on a myth of a normalized traditional foundation. This explains the futurist reinterpretation of most past never was alt histories. Of the future, in regard to American mythology, folklorist Alan Dundes spells this out very thoroughly in Thinking Ahead, but a few examples may help clarify the point.
It is not only the past that is sacrificed for the future, it is also the present. Sometimes it is an unpleasant present which is denied in favor of a reference to a brighter future. Better luck next time and tomorrow's another day are examples. In addition, there is the proverbial cry of baseball fans backing a loser. Wait till next year. But it is not just the unpleasant present which is denied. Americans are so future-oriented, they are discontent even with pleasant presents. For the present reality, no matter how good it is, can never be as good as the future might be. With Americans and their belief in efficiency, evolution, perfectibility, etc., the best is yet to come. Whatever one has, one hears, "You ain't seen nothing yet." The same kind of sentiment is expressed in the American military slogan, "We have not yet begun to fight." Nevertheless, in American culture, one never does catch up with the carrot on a stick in front of the donkey. One never does reach the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Now, there is a compact folkloristic expression of the American worldview.
Is it any wonder that blind progress has yielded the results that it has? One cannot help but be reminded of the word of the hungry ghosts in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. For those unfamiliar with this image, Chogyam Trungpa provides a concise summary. In the hungry ghost realm, there is a tremendous feeling of richness, of gathering a lot of possessions. Whatever you want, you do not have to look for. We only need to turn to our smartphones to see this at work. After all, the Bardo refers not to just the state after death, but psychological realms we must contend with at all stages of existence. He continues,
This makes us more hungry, more deprived, because we get satisfaction not from possessing alone, but from searching. This is symbolized by the image of a person with a gigantic belly and extremely thin neck and tiny mouth. The joy of possessing does not bring us pleasure anymore once we already possess something, and we are constantly trying to look for more possessions.
The economic system that we have developed, in accord with our cultural experience of time, in accord with our ideology of progress, and so on, promote the psychological state being described here. Capitalist economies depend on extraction and consumption. The hungry ghosts, eating food that provides no real sustenance, always hungry, never satisfied, grasping at the simulacra of an emotional, familial, romantic, or personal sacred. In America in particular, we marry progress and teleology. Almost always, this goal-oriented obsession was strapped to the front of the Manifest Destiny Wells Fargo gravy train, paved over the homes and graves of the indigenous peoples, and then exported to a long list of island colonies who weren't enlightened enough to see we were there to civilize them. After thumbing our nose at the Spanish toward the end of the 19th century for their imperialism and brutality, we did much the same. But we did it for their own good, of course. Not justified by divinity, at least no more than through his providence, which allowed for American freedom to come to an island near you. In the face of massive ecological and environmental upheaval, it is easy to assume that at some point, people will have to bring about systemic change from the bottom up. This bears a striking resemblance to other forms of millenarianism, another guise of the postmodern end of history, wherein the enlightened progressives can link hands and save the world. This idea appears in the capitalistic green movement and similar forms of progressivism, which says that if people vote with their dollars within the framework of capitalism, and if the vote comes from a majority, it'll force a shift of priorities, and may be the only way for a capitalist state to maintain cogency in the face of declining resources, material and human, that cannot support a never-ending increase in profits, even with the addition of technological advance in the mix. Despite the hopeful optimism of this opinion, there is a fair chance the underlying premise is flawed. We may be able to generate cultural reform from within the system in the way that counterculture attempts, and more rarely succeeds, at doing. But this does not extend far. Consider instead the idea that the ecological and economic pressures are already intensifying. The destratification is already underway, though we have a hard time seeing it, because even rapid change, in a historic sense, may still seem slow to our eyes. The carrying capacity of our population is such that backward movement to earlier forms of society, or even a momentary lapse in the production chain, would lead to nothing short of unmitigated disaster. And yet for all that, what other future can we realistically imagine for ourselves? You have been listening to Narrative Machines. More work from the author can be found at jameskirkio.com and modernmythology.net. To support the production of work such as this, visit patreon.com/mythosmedia.